He collapses against the wall, his face a mask of pure, raw agony, a sound tearing from his throat that's not human, more animal, wounded and cornered. His hands claw at his tie, his knuckles white as bone, pulling it tighter, like he can choke the air out of the room, choke the truth out of existence. He's screaming now, a broken sound, guttural, desperate. It's not a scream of anger at me, not yet. It's the sound of his world imploding. The world he built, the shiny, precarious tower, built on the foundation of my trust, my work, my life. He's screaming because the cornerstone just vanished. He's screaming because she is blacklisted. Everywhere. Overnight. He looks up then, his eyes finding mine across the room, red-rimmed, frantic. There's a flicker of comprehension in them, a dawning horror. He sees the quiet control in my posture, the absence of shock, the stillness that wasn't there minutes ago. He sees the architect of his ruin standing perfectly still, watching him fall. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version in the comments below. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, it helps me more than you know. We had a good life. Or I thought we did. Looking back, the polished surface was always just a little too bright, reflecting something that wasn't entirely real. My life was a carefully constructed thing. Years spent building a career in a cutthroat industry, forging connections, earning respect, cultivating a network that was more than just names on a screen. It was trust, reciprocal favors, late-night strategy sessions, whispered confidences over bad conference call lines, shared victories, and commiserated losses. This network was my armor, my weapon, my safety net. It was my value, beyond a job title or a salary. It was woven into the fabric of who I was.
He was part of that life.
My husband, David. He worked in the same broader field, but in a slightly different niche. Less public-facing, more internal politics, slower climb. We met at an industry event. He was charming, attentive, seemed genuinely impressed by what I had built. He talked about his own ambitions, his frustrations with the pace of his progress. I listened, offered advice, sometimes made introductions where I genuinely thought there was a mutual benefit. My contacts weren't commodities to be traded. They were relationships. I guarded them fiercely, shared them judiciously. David understood this. Or he said he did. Our home was our sanctuary. Dinner parties with colleagues, quiet evenings on the sofa, planning future trips, talking about starting a family. He was my partner, my confidant. We shared everything. Our dreams were intertwined, our successes celebrated together. When I got a major promotion, he threw a surprise party. When he landed a challenging new project, I was his sounding board, helping him navigate the political landscape. I loved him. I trusted him implicitly. There was no reason not to. He was my anchor in the sometimes turbulent waters of my professional world. He knew the value of my network better than anyone. He saw the doors it opened, the leverage it provided. He saw the power it held. The first crack in the facade was subtle. The late nights started piling up. Not just one or two, but a steady pattern. He was always swamped at work. He'd come home exhausted, distant. Conversations became transactional, brief recaps of the day, logistics, then silence. The easy intimacy, the shared laughter, it just faded. I asked if everything was okay. He'd snap, or sigh, or tell me I was being paranoid, that work was just crazy right now. He'd say he was doing it for us, for our future. His ambition, once a shared fire, started to feel like something consuming him and shutting me out. Then came the phone. Always clutched tight. Never left lying around. A new level of secrecy around his calls and messages. A jumpiness when I entered a room. Small things, easily explained away by stress, by the pressure he claimed he was under. I tried to reignite things. Planned a weekend getaway. He canceled last minute, citing an urgent work crisis. It hurt. Not just the cancellation, but the casual way he did it, as if my feelings were an afterthought. My gut started to twist, a cold knot forming low in my stomach. This wasn't the man I married. I began watching him, subtly. Not because I suspected betrayal yet, not in the way it unfolded, but because I was genuinely worried about him. His moods swung wildly. He'd be manic one moment, talking about a breakthrough at work, then sink into a sullen silence. His finances got opaque. Joint accounts were fine, but he started talking about personal investments I didn't understand, seemed cagey about details. He dismissed my questions as me not understanding the market. My field was complex. His seemed suddenly cloaked in unnecessary jargon and secrecy. Then the first truly strange thing happened. A contact, someone I'd known for 15 years, a cornerstone of my network, called me. He sounded hesitant. He mentioned David's name, asked if I'd vouched for him introducing someone else. He wouldn't elaborate, just said it was unusual and wanted to check. My blood ran cold. David never introduced people using my name. Not without asking. Not without a clear, mutual purpose I approved of. I brushed it off to my contact, made a joke about David being enthusiastic, but the conversation left me rattled. More calls followed. From different people. People I'd introduced David to over the years. People he now seemed to be leveraging in ways that felt off. They were getting calls, emails, requests for meetings from David, often involving introductions to someone named Celeste. The questions were subtle at first. David mentioned you. Is Celeste that rising star you told me about? David said you thought Celeste was a perfect fit for X project. Except I'd never mentioned Celeste. I'd never heard her name. The knot in my stomach tightened into a hard, painful ball. Paranoia warred with a growing sense of dread. I started checking his phone records. It felt invasive, violating the last vestiges of trust, but the alternative, not knowing, letting this cold suspicion fester, was unbearable. What I found wasn't an affair, not in the classic sense. It was something colder, more calculated. A string of calls to numbers I didn't recognize, at odd hours. Cross-referenced with email headers I managed to glimpse on his laptop screen when he wasn't looking. The name Celeste appeared over and over, alongside the names of my most valuable contacts. My hands trembled as I pieced it together. It wasn't just a relationship. It was a professional partnership. He was using my network, the one I'd painstakingly built over decades, to open doors for her. He wasn't just having an affair. He was stealing my professional capital and investing it in his mistress's career. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath. It wasn't just the betrayal of our marriage vows, though that was a gaping wound. It was the desecration of my professional life, the undermining of my value, the theft of something deeply personal and hard-won. He wasn't just sleeping with someone else. He was using my very identity, my reputation, my relationships as currency to advance hers. He saw my network not as a sacred trust, but as a resource to be mined. And he was mining it for her. The pain was blinding, but beneath it, a cold, hard anger began to set. I didn't scream. I didn't confront him immediately. I went silent.
I watched.
I listened. I pieced together the extent of his deception. He had been systematically going through my professional contacts, identifying the ones most valuable to Celeste's specific niche, and finding angles to introduce her, using his connection to me as the golden ticket. He'd invent scenarios, imply my endorsement, leverage the trust one had built. Celeste, meanwhile, was suddenly everywhere. Articles online mentioned her as a rising star, landing prestigious projects, speaking at conferences. Her bio often mentioned connections to key players in the industry, players I knew, people who had unknowingly been connected to her through David, using my name as the bridge. My own network was now buzzing about her, sometimes directly asking me, awkwardly, about my protégé or colleague Celeste. It was excruciating. Each mention was a fresh stab wound. I felt exposed, vulnerable. My relationships, my professional reputation, were being exploited by the two people who should have been the safest to me, my husband and his mistress. And I was trapped. If I confronted him, I risked exploding the situation, potentially damaging my own standing by revealing my husband's unethical behavior, which reflected on me. How could I explain that my own husband had stolen my contacts? It sounded insane. And how could I stop Celeste without looking petty or jealous? They had used my assets to build her legitimacy, and now attacking her felt like attacking something semi-legitimate, even if its foundation was rotten. This was my lowest point. I felt like a ghost in my own life, watching my husband build a future with another woman using the very tools I had created. My home felt alien, tainted. My professional world felt contaminated. Every conversation with a colleague felt like a potential minefield. I felt powerless, diminished. They had taken my power, wrapped it up, and given it to her. I would sit in my office, staring out the window, feeling the weight of the betrayal, the sheer audacity of it, crushing me. Sleep offered no escape. My dreams were filled with faceless contacts and Celeste's smiling face, always just out of reach, using connections that should have been mine. I was losing ground, professionally and personally, and I couldn't see a way out that didn't involve self-immolation. The carefully constructed life I had built was crumbling, brick by painstaking brick, and the people swinging the sledgehammer were the ones I had loved and trusted. Something shifted within me during those dark weeks. The helplessness, the pain, the fear of losing everything, it began to curdle into something colder, something harder. I stopped seeing myself as a victim. I started seeing myself as a strategist who had been outmaneuvered. But they had made a critical error. They had underestimated me. They had used my network, yes, but they hadn't taken it. It was still mine. The relationships, the trust, the deep understanding of how things really worked in our industry, that was still within my control. They had stolen the address book, but not the ability to make the calls count. I realized confronting David emotionally would achieve nothing. It would descend into lies, gaslighting, and damage control on his part. Exposing the affair would be personally cathartic, but professionally messy. No, this required a different approach. An approach that targeted the root of their collaboration, her career, built on my stolen foundation. My network was my power. They had weaponized it against me. I would weaponize it back. But not in a messy, public way. I needed to be precise, surgical. I needed to demonstrate that while they could steal the map, they couldn't navigate the territory like I could. My strategy began to form. It wasn't about revealing the affair. It wasn't even directly about David's theft. It was about exposing the instability of Celeste's rise. A rise that was too fast, too unexplained, too reliant on connections she hadn't earned herself. My network valued authenticity, long-term relationships, proven track records. Someone rocketing to the top purely on introductions, without the years of groundwork, would eventually attract scrutiny. I just needed to accelerate that scrutiny. I began by reaching out to my most trusted contacts. Not with accusations, but with carefully phrased questions. Subtle observations. I'm curious about this Celeste Smith who seems to be everywhere lately. David has mentioned her. Have you worked with her directly? What's your impression? I wasn't gossiping. I was gathering intelligence, planting seeds of doubt. I knew the key players talked. They vetted people. A few strategically placed questions, from someone whose judgment they trusted, would start a quiet ripple. Then, I started leveraging my network for myself in specific, visible ways that subtly highlighted the difference between earned success and manufactured access. I took on a high-profile project that required deep, long-standing trust. I made public appearances with contacts I knew David had tried to leverage for Celeste, making it clear my relationships with them were strong and independent. I didn't mention David or Celeste, but the message was clear. My network was robust, active, and loyal. Simultaneously, I started quietly investigating Celeste's background beyond the glossy articles. I knew people who knew people. I looked into her educational claims, her previous employment, the timelines of her projects. David, blinded by his infatuation and her apparent success, had been careless. He'd vouched for her based on potential, not substance. I found inconsistencies, exaggerations, projects where her role was minimal but spun as central. Small deceptions that, when viewed collectively, painted a picture of someone who wasn't just using stolen contacts, but was also inflating her own credentials to meet the expectations those contacts generated. I compiled the information, not in a dossier, but in a series of discrete, verifiable facts. I identified the key gatekeepers in the industry, the ones whose opinions could make or break a career, the ones David had leveraged most aggressively. I didn't send anonymous tips. That was amateur. I chose 3 key contacts, people whose integrity was beyond reproach, people who had also expressed quiet bewilderment or concern about Celeste's sudden prominence. I met with each of them individually. I didn't present a conspiracy theory. I presented facts. Here is what Celeste claims about Project X. Here is what my contact, John Doe, who was actually on that project, remembers. Here is the timeline she presents for her role at Company Y. Here are their official records. I showed them the inconsistencies, the timeline overlaps that suggested fabricated experience, the reliance on introductions rather than earned access. I never mentioned David or our marriage. I framed it purely as a professional concern, maintaining the integrity of our network, ensuring trust was placed in capable, ethical hands. I let them connect the dots regarding how she got these introductions so easily. My silence on that point was louder than any accusation. They understood. The people I spoke to valued the sanctity of their connections, the reputations they had built. They saw the potential damage Celeste's meteoric, potentially fraudulent, rise could do to the ecosystem. Using stolen contacts was one thing, messy, unethical, but sometimes overlooked. Fabricating experience to capitalize on those contacts was career suicide. And leveraging my network to do it? That was an insult they wouldn't tolerate. The wheels started turning, silently at first, then picking up speed. My contacts didn't make a public spectacle. Our industry handled these things discreetly. Queries were made. Background checks were run, deeper than the superficial ones David had bypassed. The inconsistencies I found were verified. Celeste was quietly vetted, then just as quietly flagged. Emails stopped being returned. Meeting requests were politely declined. Opportunities vanished before they even materialized. The prestigious project she was poised to land suddenly went to someone else. The speaking slot at the major conference was reassigned. The blacklisting wasn't a formal announcement. It was a collective, unspoken agreement within the network. Celeste became radioactive. Her name, once whispered as the next big thing, became synonymous with unreliable, unethical, toxic. She was out. Not just from one project, but from the inner circle, the trust network that mattered. Her shiny tower, built on a foundation of sand and stolen contacts, collapsed. That's when he came home. He'd been with her, I think, celebrating some perceived victory, oblivious. The news must have hit them like a tidal wave. Celeste, the golden goose, suddenly persona non grata. And he knew, instinctively, that her fall meant his fall too. His access to her, the future he'd envisioned, built on her success powered by my contacts, was gone. He walked in, his face pale, his eyes wild. He didn't see me at first. He was on his phone, shouting, demanding to know what happened, who was responsible. He was pacing, running a hand through his hair, his tie askew. He looked like a man losing his mind. He threw the phone across the room. It shattered against the wall. That's when the screaming started. The raw, animal sound of everything he'd sacrificed our marriage for, crumbling before his eyes. He screamed her name. He screamed about the injustice, the unfairness. How could this happen? He hadn't connected it to me yet. He was still caught in the shock of her sudden downfall. He was raging against an invisible enemy, the network itself turning on her. Then he looked at me, standing there,
Quiet. Calm.
watching him, and in my eyes, he saw not a grieving wife, not a clueless partner, but the architect. He saw the stillness, the control. He saw the absence of surprise. The pieces clicked into place for him then. The strange calls I'd been getting months ago. The subtle questions from my contacts. My sudden, low-key flurry of professional activity that had solidified my own position just as hers was starting to wobble. He saw it all. His screaming stopped, replaced by a choked gasp. His face contorted, the raw agony morphing into pure, unadulterated hatred and fear. "You," he whispered, the sound thick with disbelief. You did this. I didn't need to say yes. My silence was confirmation. My steady gaze held his as he reeled. He had used my power against me. He had stolen my network to build her up and tear me down. And I had used that same network, the very thing he thought he'd plundered successfully, to dismantle everything he had built with her, leaving him with nothing. He thought he'd won by taking my contacts. He didn't realize that the contacts were useless without the trust, the history, the real relationships I had built. He stole the shell. I still controlled the spirit. He lunged towards me, his hands fisted, his face a mask of fury. But he stopped short. He saw something in my eyes, something cold and resolute. He saw that I wasn't afraid. He saw that I had already won. He collapsed against the wall then, the screaming starting anew, but this time it was directed at me. Accusations, curses, pleas. He called me a monster, a cruel bitch, said I'd ruined his life, ruined her life. He finally revealed the full extent of his actions, not in confession, but in enraged accusations. He detailed how he'd used my name, how he'd lied, how they'd planned their future using the opportunities he'd stolen from me. He laid bare the entire, ugly truth in his desperate, collapsing rage. I listened, my face expressionless. Each word he screamed, each confession veiled as an accusation, only solidified my resolve. He wasn't just a cheating husband. He was a thief, a liar, a parasite who had fed on my success. When he finally exhausted himself, sinking to the floor in ragged sobs, the room fell silent except for his gasping breaths. I looked at him, the man I had loved, broken and pathetic at my feet, the wreckage of his betrayal scattered around him. There was no triumph in me, only a profound, weary emptiness. The victory was complete, devastatingly so, but it tasted like ash. The aftermath was quiet, clinical. Divorce papers were filed. There was no fight over assets. Everything seemed insignificant after what had transpired. He left, taking the remnants of his shattered life with him. Celeste vanished from the professional scene entirely. Her social media went dark. Her name was no longer mentioned. My network rallied around me, quietly. My trusted contacts didn't pry into the personal drama, but their professional respect and support were unwavering. They had seen the truth of where the real power lay, who had the genuine relationships, who operated with integrity. If anything, my standing within the industry was solidified. I had proven I could navigate treacherous waters, protect my interests, and ensure the integrity of the network itself. I hadn't just survived. I had demonstrated strength and strategic brilliance under unimaginable pressure. Winning didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like the slow process of stitching myself back together. The trust was gone forever, a void where love used to be. The man I married was a stranger I had systematically dismantled. The victory was the reclaiming of myself, my work, my power, from the people who had tried to steal it. It was the knowledge that I could build and rebuild and protect what was mine. It was a cold, quiet satisfaction, tempered by the sorrow of what was lost. My life was quieter now, simpler in some ways. I focused on my work, on nurturing the genuine connections that remained, the ones that had passed the ultimate test. I was bruised, but not broken. I had faced the storm and emerged, not unscathed, but undeniably stronger, forged in the fire of betrayal. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version in the comments below. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.